share with y'all. Southerners on New Ground and the National Black Justice Coalition. But it's so fortuitous that we're having this conversation because April 4th, 1967, 55 years ago, King gave that famous Beyond Silence, Break into Silence. And to have this generational conversation, I think is spot on. So let's get to it. Glad to be a part of this. And I'm here in Durham, North Carolina.
Awesome. So we will let all of our facilitators introduce themselves in the best way that they like to share, not necessarily concerned about titles or what you do, but more about who you are. So I will start with Darian.
Hello, everybody. Happy to be here. And my name is Darian Dixon, originally from Baltimore City, Maryland, but now I'm a Raleigh transplant, if you will. Been at NC State for 4 years now, and this is on the road to my PhD in sociology. So happy to be a part of this conversation. And I remember Mandy from last year's intergenerational conversation. So lovely to see you again, and lovely to be here with all these other lovely faces. So I'll pass it to Elizabeth.
Hi, everyone. Elizabeth Nelson, and I hope I'm the right Elizabeth. There's usually like 5 anywhere I go. But mostly from North Carolina is the way I put it, and really happy to be here. Queer femme academic, and excited to be sort of exploring what it means to answer Audre Lorde's call to the erotic life in middle age. So that's kind of where I am as I show up here. And I will pass it to I'm not sure who else facilitators are. Lai? Yes? Okay.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lele. I'm a student here at North Carolina. I'm originally from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, but I'm kind of transplanted here too. Outside of that, I'm a Vietnamese American, and I try to be very involved on campus. I'll pass it off to Hong An.
Thanks so much. Thanks everyone for having me. Excited to be a part of this conversation and meet new people, and happy to always share space with Mandy, who I've known Mandy for a long time. So it's always good to be in space with you. My name is Hong An Chung. I go by she, her, hers, and I'm zooming in from Durham, also Durham, North Carolina. On the unceded lands of the Shakora, and Sissepaw peoples. And I am the daughter of Vietnamese refugees, and I'm also a teacher. I'm the middle child of 5 kids, so I am I'm the one who's constantly trying to bring people together. I'm the stitch in the family. At least I try to be. That's how I tend to operate in circles, is someone who's trying to make connections and bring everyone together. And what else can I say? And I've been living in Durham as my chosen home, with lots of chosen family and also blood family here now for going on 25 years. So really love North Carolina, and have really learned so much from people like Mandy and other amazing elders and community folk over the years in Durham and throughout the Triangle. So happy to be here. Thanks for asking me to join you all. I'll pass it to Nati.
Thank you so much, and thank you for everyone else that has shared so far. I'm looking forward to get to know every single one of you, because I know you guys are all amazing and empowering. But my name is Nati. My pronouns are she, her, ella. I am a first-generation Latinx student here at NC State. I am a sophomore at NC State. I am a friend, I'm a daughter, I'm also a middle child, so I can definitely understand with the, making everyone feel welcome and getting those families together. But yeah, I'm looking forward to sharing this space with every single one of you, and I'm excited to be here. And I will pass it on to, is it just anyone on the call I can pass it on to?
I think I'll catch it from here.
Okay, sorry about that.
no, you're fine. I had to check myself, like to make sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Alexia's, she, her pronouns. On campus, I may serve as an AD in Multicultural Student Affairs, but today I am just a vessel, a sponge here to soak up all the information, all the history, and all the perspectives we have in the space. So as you can tell, I am really excited about today's conversation. And so I am so hopeful and so happy that you all have chosen to be here in this space with us, because it is a choice, and a choice is powerful. So I always want to respect that decision. So as we start this conversation, I want to begin with sharing that we are going to do this setup as best we can virtually, and paying respect to trying to do pre-talking circles, but also honor in the space that we may not have a Native or Indigenous folk running the issue of the space, pay respect to their traditions that we do use to further our own advances. And when we talk about solidarity and liberation, we have to honor and really speak on unspoken things and really prevent erasure of practices that may not come from our own culture. So I do want to share that out, that first, as we jump into this conversation, we will do virtual talking circle. And what that looks like is there will be 3 questions that will be asked, and anyone can join in and share their perspective, not just the panelists pinned on the screen. And if you don't want to share out verbally, you can choose to drop it in the chat. And what this space is for is kind of just to frame us on a beginning to really begin to spark our thoughts and to see each other how we see different questions. There is no right or wrong. This is just where we get to just come and be ourselves and share our first thought that comes to mind. So before we jump into those 3 questions, we want to provide a basis of some definitions of some terminology that we'll use a lot in this conversation, just because having a common understanding is important. Even though we understand that it could be different definitions and meanings and perspectives, just want to have a starting point for where we're speaking of, and then we can grow and mold the space together, which is like the key to this conversation. So as we navigate this conversation, and I just had my whole definition thing up and I just exited out. Don't we just love technology, y'all? I know I got to love technology. So let me pull this right on back up to help myself. Just one moment, please, because we love a good technology glitch that's random. I know I do. So the 3 words that we will be navigating today are going to be community care, silos, and we're going to talk about, of course, solidarity. So as we navigate through this conversation, those 3 terms or concepts are deeply rooted. And so we know that these terms can carry different emotions, memories, but just want to provide a starting point. So as I begin to share these terms, feel free to go ahead and start dropping in the chat anything, any thought, word, feeling, or emotion that comes to mind. So I'll begin with a tweet that Nikita Valeria made in 2019. They stated, shouting self-care at people who actually needs community care is how we fail people. So here we center community care because we want to focus less on the individualistic concepts that can cause harm and zone in on the interpersonal acts of compassion that centers taking care of the collective, one person taking care of another. And this can look like many things, from assessment of basic needs to providing psychological or spiritual support. And so for me, when I think of the term community care, I think of mutual aid, and I think in the financial support and fight for our trans members in the community in ways that we create funds, or Durham County creates free markets. And so I get excited about community care when we think about how we debunk some of the capitalist things we have in our society. Solidarity, according to Webster now, this definition, I wanted to figure out how to frame this one. So I was like, I'm gonna go a little basic because it's gonna open up eyes to this one for me. Typically, when I was looking at the word solidarity, you see so much about unity as a group or a class that's really produced or focused on a goal, focused on a community set of interests, objectives, and standards. And sometimes in these definitions, even a common enemy or a common dislike. And so I look at these definitions, the word solidarity was broken down to seem really basic and just, But in its word itself and the definition itself, it begins to pose so many questions about how do we see solidarity? Does solidarity only exist in space of turmoil, or does it exist in spaces of just healing and excitement and appreciation for life itself? So we will get into that as we further discuss today and hear from different thoughts and minds of how solidarity rests with you. And then finally, we have silos, which typically is adjusted as a place of isolated grouping or space or department that functions apart from others. And sometimes we often look at this as a way of hindering communication and cooperation. So again, this is just a baseline, and I know from this conversation it is going to grow, and the definition that we may use or adjust will change by the end of this call. So again, thank you all for being in community and choosing to be in community with us. And at this point, I will wrap myself up because my mouth is dry, and I will pass it on to our facilitator, Mandy Carter.
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you so much. And I'm sitting here looking at the screen of everyone, and I forgot to say that I turned 73. Am I 72? I can't remember, just past Scorpio. But I only share that because when I'm looking at the screen, and I love this, Jamiko, the intentionality of this intergenerational thing going on. And also, I'm not on a college campus. So this kind of like, what is it called, town gown thing that you have going on, like whether it's Duke or we have 11 historically Black colleges. So I am just humbled and honored that we can have this conversation amongst us all. I'll start the ball rolling a little bit. Can we just talk about what just happened yesterday up here in the United States Congress, trying to figure out a way to do away that vote? Don't even. But before I get into that, I guess what I really would like to just share real quick, if we went around and each one of us shared a little bit of our story about how we ended up being in this conversation. My first 18 years, I was a ward of the state of New York, born November 2nd, 1948, part of the baby boomers. Our mother left and never came back. So my first 18 years was in the Albany Children's Home, Schenectady Children's Home, a Black farm family down in Chatham Center. But what intrigues me most is how did we end up here to have this conversation? And I would like to kick that off in terms of what we figure out, what we want to do with the conversation about now, and then what do we do it moving forward? And again, that town gown, grassroots, academia, and also just, I think I said some first generation students on here as well. So can I pass it on to Lee? Pass it on to you, is that all right?
Yeah, thank you. So I'm also a first generation student. My mom, grandma, and uncle actually immigrated following the Vietnam War. And so they pretty much up and moved, and they ended up in Philadelphia where my siblings and I happened. So there's a lot of, I guess, their opinions and views on America were very much shaped by the first experiences they had here. So that was very like different for me growing up. There's been a lot of navigating for myself, like finding a way to like combine my heritage, being Vietnamese, as well as being American, and finding my way along here. I ended up down here in North Carolina where I'm in school, and pretty much I wanted to find a community for myself that could understand what I'm going through. I was raised in a lot of predominantly white areas, a lot of rural areas, and a lot of like generally lower class areas. So I wanted to find myself a community, and I ended up on Asian Student Association. Over time, like I saw that the club was kind of losing itself in that it wasn't doing a lot of the meaningful and impactful things that its mission statement set out to be. So this previous year, like I went on to the board to become president, and I'm trying to make meaningful and impactful conversations, not just for the Asian community, but as well as show solidarity among minorities, because although we have very different experiences, I think that it's very important for us to all like understand the complexity of the situation and how solidarity works, but strive for a similar end goal. With that being said, a lot of mouthful, I'm gonna pass it off to Nati.
Yes, thank you for sharing and happy birthday, Mandy, by the way. But yes, so my story, my roots, my raíces, my roots go back to Mexico. I am Mexican American. My parents come from Mexico. My dad immigrated to the United States when he was about 15, 16 years old. He came to Georgia. He came to work in the fields. He was growing peaches and, doing all that harsh work out there. And then he eventually ended up in North Carolina, where he then was able to get a more stable job. And my dad growing up, he was very much like, I have to learn, I have to grasp all these opportunities that America has to offer, because at the time, Mexico was like, in such a bad, just the economy itself and the people. And so he came here for a better opportunity for his future family, which is me. And he ended up learning Spanish. I mean, he ended up learning English. He ended up learning it better and better. And then eventually he got a better job than working in the fields. And then he was eventually, my mom and him were able to get married. And then they, raised us here in North Carolina. I've been born and raised in Lenoir, North Carolina, which is on the west side of North Carolina near the mountains. Grandfather Mountain. And so, growing up, I grew up in a small rural area, mostly white populated, a predominantly white middle school, elementary school. And I've seen that throughout my life. And I feel like my identity, myself, I wasn't really able to embrace my identity, who I was and who others were. I would see other people of color looked down upon or seen as less in a way. And that would always make me so frustrated and angry and mad in a sense. And I would always be like, they're so beautiful, they're so empowered. And you just it's so crazy how people are so blinded by just blinded by ignorance and racism and everything. So growing up, I think I, really grew frustrated with that. And I just kept seeing it over and over until thankfully I was able to come to NC State and definitely grow in my own identity, finally be able to embrace who I am as a first generation Latinx student. Not only was I able to embrace myself and my identity, I am able now to be someone who is able to be there for other marginalized communities, such as Black and Brown communities, Asian communities, and everything. And I think it's just so empowering and a human thing to do when we stand up for each other. And it's the littlest things that always matter. And I feel like that's why we're here, because it's the little conversations. This might seem like a little conversation, but at heart, it's a big conversation that we should have. And we should continue to have not only these Zoom spaces, but outside of our families and our friends and everyone that we come across, because it's always the littlest things that matter. So yes, and I will pass it on to whoever wants to speak next.
I'll go. Yeah. So I'll start with recent history with how I got here. So Jamiko, he invited me, and it's funny how we're connected. So I want to say 2019 is when we first crossed paths in the African American Cultural Center, AACC. And we crossed paths because of my involvement with the Black Graduate Student Association. Back then, I was just one of the general body members, and so I cut hair, and I cut my own hair and stuff. And I came across Jamiko, and he found out through word of mouth that I cut hair for other people as well. So ever since 2019, we've been building a friendship, and I've just been cutting his hair all along, all these years. But what's really dope is how the African American Cultural Center allowed for us to cross paths. And that my involvement with BGSA, which I started off as just a member, and now I'm in my second consecutive year as the president of the org. But with Jamiko's involvement with on-campus resident life in NC State, it's crazy how our paths crossed. And now, years later, after that initial interaction, we're having this conversation about solidarity, community care, and just it's wild just how one interaction can lead to years of friendship, years of conversations, and years of just building solidarity on a predominantly white campus. So when I think about how that goes into the bigger picture of things, the life of just talking from my own experience, a Black student on a PWI, predominantly white institution, it is so intriguing to navigate because there's elements of, there's the majority of what's going on here culturally, racially, and even societally. And I'm walking through it and I'm seeing how I fit in it and also what I bring to the community, the NC State community. And it's just so intriguing looking back at how 4 years here so far have led to this moment right here. So going back to a little bit farther to how I even ended up in Raleigh. So growing up in Baltimore City, Maryland, it was so intriguing where when I look back, it wasn't like I lived in a rough neighborhood. It didn't feel like it. It didn't feel like what you see on TV and in movies. But coming from that, I gotta understand what that means for me to leave my home and then make it into a graduate school. Like when I was younger, I didn't know what graduate school was. I didn't know that I'd get a PhD in anything and not be considered like a medical doctor. So like all of this stuff is just like really hit me where it's like, yo, I'm really here doing stuff that I'm a first generation doctorate student in my family. And it's so amazing to just see how education, to see how just taking advantage of opportunities that come my way make for me to be able to make opportunities for other people so that I can share what I know, share what knowledge I've learned from other people and just keeping it so that I'm a vessel and I'm allowing people to do as they please and do what allows them to be happy. And that goes into the element of community care. And I remember when coronavirus first hit, and there was like a lot of, not a lot of information, a lot of conversation about self-care. And I was like, yo, it's one thing to, talk about self-care and stuff, but honestly, not everybody can take care of themselves, not because they're, incapable of it. However, there's some elements of self-care that go along with like class privilege and go along with just, if we so focus on just the individual taking care of themselves, then we lose sight of what it means to take care of each other, what it means to talk about community care, what it means to talk about solidarity in a way where there's unity across whatever social identity background you want to name. And with this conversation, I definitely want to add to what everybody else has to say about community care, solidarity, and breaking through our own silos, because we all have them. We all end up in them in some form of fashion. So acknowledging that is the first step to saying, hey, I'm in a silo, but wait a minute. There's so much knowledge that I have here and I can share with other people. And I can, talk to other people in their silos and say, what's good? How you doing? So happy to be here. And I will pass it to, yes, who wants to go next, actually?
I'll go next. Thanks, Darian. I'll just go next because it just like really made me think what you were saying, Darian. Thanks for what you're saying. First of all, I want to say you have beautiful light in your video. You're just glowing. So I don't know where you are, but my sky is gray, but you seem like you're in Hawaii or something. I'm a video photo person, so I'm like always paying attention to people's video light in the Zooms, but you've got beautiful light. Anyway, but I also wanted to just say, like, following you, because what your comment made me think of was just like thinking about like how much we're up against and how great it is that we're even here, to commend us for even being here, because just thinking about the institutions of white supremacy that dominate our everyday lives are get in the way constantly of us finding each other, right? That we actually have to work so hard to find each other. And I feel like even in each other, meaning like even myself, thinking about my own experience, I also went to a predominantly, white school in Arizona. So I grew up in Arizona, but I didn't have an Asian community. I started doing political organizing, but identifying with the labor issues on the border, because that was that. And I didn't really even see my own race at the time. I didn't see my own ethnicity. It was really like, I was sort of like, kind of a Marxist kid who was thinking more about class and didn't even see my own identity or my own cultural background, because it was a source of shame for me, like for growing up. And so even as I was coming into a political consciousness as a teenager, it really was about being anti-capitalist and being against worker exploitation, being against war and imperialism, which seemed somehow disconnected to kind of race relations in the US and my lived experience and how I experienced racism every day. As an immigrant family who, whose parents spoke with an accent and being poor and all of this. So it's interesting that, even for me to find my own, my own Asian community or a diasporic Asian community. And there's also just even issues of thinking about solidarity for Asians in America, because there's a lot of divisions even within the Asian community, because obviously there's different ethnicities and different national histories that divide us. So it's just interesting that, even, in the institutions that we're navigating, it's very hard for us to find each other. So find each other within our kind of, racial and ethnic groups, but then also across those boundaries. So just thinking about that in terms of like those different levels of work that we're all having to do on a constant basis to find each other. So, yeah, that's all. I will pass it on to whoever else wants to go.
Yeah, I'd love to follow up on that, just because, and I'll just, I find age to be helpful here, because I feel really lucky to have been part of intergenerational conversations for a lot of my life in different ways. So I'm about to turn 49. It's coming close. And that means that I got to grow up in the 70s and 80s. And that might not sound like as great a gift as it was, but it really was in my experience. The way out of small town North Carolina was unfortunately the military, right? So my family was a military family, and we grew up with pacifist parents in that context. Pardon me as I try to swallow. So I grew up, my first experiences are actually from the Philippines, and they're predominantly not with white folks. Our family's made by adoption in multiple generations. My immediate family is, and lots of families we were around. So I didn't understand that there were white enclaves for a long time, or predominantly white spaces, which is a real gift for a white person, and also allows you to not see things for a while, right? So it's a combination of things. And so I've had to really reflect back on those early years as I got older. I also happened to grow up, when we came back to North Carolina and lived in the States, go to school in predominantly Black schools. I had Black teachers my whole K through 12 experience. So I didn't have all white teachers until I went to college. I had Black doctors, Black priests, Black neighbors, friends. My life was surrounded, we had a lot of conscientiousness about being a white family. And there was a lot of 70s, 80s liberal intentions about doing intentional things, and then some things by virtue of where we lived and class status and things that kept us in those spaces. So I grew up with a lot of mentors in solidarity. I grew up with a lot of teachers who named racial politics and issues and relations. I grew up, now there are other issues that we didn't talk about, like so queerness was not on the table for discussion. But I did learn a lot about race and class, and to a lesser degree and in a more respectability politics way, but in a way that I still find a lot of value in now, gender, right? There were a lot of things we talked about. We learned about survival. In an event that happened last year, I was able to invoke the spirit of Mrs. Jones, who was part of my middle school experience and primarily in 6th grade, but all through the years, and how one of the lessons she taught us was how to open a bank account, how to balance a checkbook, and how to make sure you fed your family before you worried about any other kind of bills, right? So those kinds of gifts of what that looked like. And there are lots of stories that I can share about that, but I feel so grateful for those early experiences of being called in and being expected to have accountability and to have awareness and to have language and to also have a family where that was happening as well. And to be able to learn about a lot of things in, contained ways. There's still lots of learning. The learning will happen throughout my life, but I feel very grateful for that as a template, because I think I got invited into solidarity young, and then the life experience of continuing to learn about it later, too, coming out in a queer anarchist community for a while and being able to lots of solidarity work that just involved lots of communities. And so lots of stories and lots of fun times and lots of figuring things out with your mouth and hands, but also just getting those early experiences that I really treasure and I'm so grateful for now. So I don't know who would like to go next.
I just want to make an observation for all of us. What's so important about what we just did, this go around, we shared about how we got to where we are. It's all you know is all you know. And I oftentimes wonder when you walk into a room, and I'm looking even generationally at this picture right now, until someone asks you, well, who are you? Where'd you come from? What up? I think we make a lot of assumptions. And I would also share, I think the other important thing is this interesting kind of town gown thing. I'm sitting here in Durham, but raised in Albany, New York, upstate, and thinking about even being in the children's home. I think, this is the question I just posed, one of the most critical things they've done, they put us into the public school system, Mount Pleasant High School. We were just known as the kids from the home, but it would be like your social studies teachers and, the Quakers and people bringing in, this is like what, 63, 64, 65. So I'm looking at, Natalie, is it Natalie, when you talked about you were the first generation and how many other first generation, but also just, in terms of race and ethnicity and class, I did not know my birth mother was born in North Carolina until I moved here in 1982. I had not any clue. So this whole idea about thinking about who's doing social work and who's going to be going into social work in the schools like at NC State and others, like what do you pass on? What's the information? But even generationally, what I think we have in common is that we just shared our stories. How did we end up being a part of this conversation? And I'm noticing in a predominantly white institution, you have 11 historically Black colleges and universities in North Carolina, but it shouldn't be an either or, it can be a both and, if there's some intentionality of how we might try to do some mixing and mingling. So I'm just intrigued, and more importantly, what do we do with it from here? But just thank you to each one of you, just sharing a little bit about how did we end up here? That's it.
So wonderful. At this point, we'll navigate into part one of our questions, where we ask our everyone, panelists, attendees, to share their views and their stints and pieces about these questions we're going to pose. And so, Mandy, would you like me to drop these, or would you like to share these out?
To share those out, that'd be great, because I'm not sure if I'm looking at the thing we got, so I want to make sure I'm okay. You got it?
Yes, I do. I got you, Mandy. Look, we here together, okay? Care for each other's backs. All right. So first and foremost, we talk about, sharing the definition, talking about how solidarity has shown up differently for our panelists throughout their lifetime. But let's also ask outwardly, is why do you think, as attendees, as folks who've been on this journey, why do you even think we need solidarity?
I'll pass it on to someone else. I don't want to go first. Elizabeth, and then just work down the line.
Hi, learned how to use your mute. That's really good. Full disclosure, I just made a few notes so that I would have my mind organized, because every time I thought about this, I thought about it a little differently. So these are just some thoughts that I was having. That solidarity is a way to move us from the idea of equity as just reallocation or individual journeys alongside each other to that more collective vision for liberation, where folks can show up and contribute the gifts that they have in the moments that they have them, and can skill share and emotion share and support share and do all of those things. So to me, solidarity requires like some nimbleness, some figuring out when to step up and step back. It could be a great reminder of how many resources we do have among us. And then also when you're in solidarity, you can figure out the balance of when it's time to meet immediate needs versus when it's time to kind of think about moving into long-term goals, and not versus like it's an either or, but just recognizing that being in community is sometimes about that immediate, and it's not always about that future vision. And we're holding the future vision by responding in the immediate. So whomever would like to go next.
So to answer the first question, why do I think we need solidarity? Just because as humans, we're social beings, and the world revolves around relationships. So everything we do, we're influencing and impacting somebody else, whether they realize it or not. Whether it be within immediate family circle, immediate friend circle, whether you say we're going to school, and then y'all don't even throw social media in the mix. Literally everything that we do can influence the next person, which means it's important to be conscious about how we move, what we say, what we do, why we do it, so that anything that we share, anything that we act on is far none, at least neutral. Like, at least it does not hurt the next person. And ideally, everything that we do is something that empowers somebody else, teaches somebody else, allows us to share our resources with the next person, or something that's, beneficial to the collective. And we need solidarity because we can't do life alone. Like, we're supposed to be in community. We're supposed to be able to, share information generationally. I mean, that's like human history. Like, history is sharing information from one generation to the next, and recording it and sharing it, and poetry, song, storytelling, the books, just anything that keeps the train moving. So I think we need solidarity because can't do life alone. One, we're all interconnected, whether we want to believe it or not. And then the more we think of ourselves as vessels for things to move through. So when I say things, I mean like opportunities, resources, information, knowledge. When you think of yourself as like I love analogies, so get ready for those. When you think about it, energy, resources, opportunities, when everybody's in unison and in harmony and all that good stuff, things just flow. And anytime we allow the flow to keep going, that means the next person, the next generation benefits from the good that we have. And we also gotta learn from our mistakes as well. Like, it ain't just all sunshine and rainbows and stuff. Times be hard. Like, life be lifing sometimes. So we take all of those lessons and we make sure to learn from them, individually, but also collectively. So solidarity is all of that from my perspective. So to the next person we go.
Can I throw a quick one in and then I'll pass it on to Lee if I'm saying the name right? Do you remember the Muslim ban? And do you remember how many lawyers came out of everywhere to come to those airports and to those train stations and bus stations? And also, if you look at the state of North Carolina, we have an interesting system because of this. If you have the North Carolina State University system, then you got the private colleges. But, you know, you would find people saying, well, because of the way that, I don't want to get into any drama or anything, but depending how the system is set up, but when you had people saying, I'm a lawyer, I'm going to be a public advocate or whatever, but just show up and just show that there's a possibility and that kind of solidarity. The other one is here. This is interesting. For the first time in 160 years, we have our first ever Black mayor of the city of Durham. That long? Oh, you know, so when you think about women, people of color, thinking about the indigenous who was already here, I think the thing would be, what is it, what's the uniqueness of what brings us together and why? Cross race and age or whatever. And that's the thing I'm more interested in now, because it's like, it's current, but we have to think about who came before us as well. So Lee, am I saying the name right? I'll pass it on to you and then we've got two more.
Yeah, thank you. I just love what everyone had to say. And like every single time someone speaks, like there's something else I want to chime in with. But I really love what Darian had to say with like talking about how interconnected we are. Like at the end of the day, like humans are social creatures, like we're going to be drawn to one another. We can't be alone. And the same thing goes for anything we want to accomplish. We can't do it alone. And that's why we need solidarity. We need to like understand each other, understand that it's complex and work together in order to achieve our goals. And I think the first time like in my lifetime where I've ever like actually seen like masses of people like being able to come together in like terms of solidarity, like fighting for the same thing was like in like 2020 in the middle of COVID, like everyone came together after George Floyd and for Black Lives Matters, like protests and rallies all over the country. And like I was able to see this firsthand. Like I was currently like at the time living in Greenville, North Carolina, and it's right by ECU. So it's a college town and there's a lot of people going on. But like what a lot of people don't realize is like, it is a very segregated area. And even where I went to school, it's predominantly white, but they purposely placed like the school in like a lower class area that is full of more like minorities and stuff. And like for the first time, like people were able to like kind of upend themselves and see that, you know, maybe everything isn't okay. Like we think so heavily or so highly of ourselves and think that we're like untouched by racism, untouched by like corruptness in politics and in the police force. But then like as soon as like that came out, like so many different things, like at least in the community I was in, like came out. Like there were a lot of like young students in high schools like revealing like how racist their teachers really were, people coming out and talking about like crimes that were committed by them from the police that were like expected to be in that community and protect them and serve them. And so when Elizabeth was talking about how like we need to talk more about like not just like what we can do immediately, like immediate gratification, what we can immediately do, and like think more about long term as well. Like I think it was like the greatest experience like of social reform that I could see, like as far as like my lifetime is concerned. But where like at least in like the local community, like we were able to like see reform in like the local police, see like things change on a state level, and even like hold people accountable for their actions. And even today, like they're still working for it. It's not perfect, it's getting better and they're still trying. I'll pass it off to whoever wants to speak next.
Yeah, I can go. Thank you all for sharing. So speaking about solidarity and everything and your experience, Lee, or Lei, I'm sorry if I mispronounce it, but I can also relate in a sense to your experience of after the whole George Floyd incident. I think, well, especially through my experience, I grew up, you know, seeing like some sorts of racism and experiencing it myself, but I think it didn't really click with me until seeing that video of George Floyd and like seeing the video like myself through like Instagram. When I clicked on it, I was like, you know, what is this? And it was just like so crazy how like it was like one of like the first public videos ever that I had seen where it was just like people in the comments were like battling like, oh, like, you know, he deserved it or he didn't deserve it. And just like the constant battle. And I'm like, first of all, like you see the video yourself and it's just like, there shouldn't be like, you know, a battle of like, if this is right, or if this is wrong, like it is wrong, you know? And it's just like crazy. Like, I think I was about what, like 17 years old at the time. I'm 19 now. So it was just like to look at that video and see like, wow, like this is a country that we've like grown up in. And I think it was just like a little like epiphany for me, or like a state of realization to where like where I was living, like what was going on. Again, I am from a small town, so I really didn't see it that much as like I heard from like bigger cities, like such as like Charlotte, North Carolina, or like New York or California or Texas. And like my small little town, like none of this, like, you know, it would happen, but like not like as big. So seeing that video for the first time, it just like, it broke my soul. It broke who I was as a person. And it made me realize that the trust that I have within people, and within people that are so called to be people that are supposed to protect us and serve, you know, their communities, was where I really sat back and like reflect on like what I need to do for this community, or what I need to do for my community. Because if the older adults, the older people, the people that serve us, the people that are supposed to protect us aren't doing the correct thing as humans, then we cannot, or I can't like stand by and just watch all of this happen in a sense. And so that's when I know COVID was going around, COVID was happening during the time of the pandemic. And within my community, they were having a protest. And I was surprised that my community wanted to do a protest, because again, I didn't know people within my community were willing and open to do this. Because when you would hear like a big protest, like they would happen like bigger cities rather than smaller cities. But after the George Floyd incident, I feel like a lot of like smaller communities and just like all the communities within themselves were coming out to like host protests and reforms and everything like that. So I attended my first protest, and it was absolutely empowering. Even though it was like 15, 20 of us, that's all you need. You only need a few people to feel that empowerment within yourself, because it was amazing being able to chant those like inspiring and strong words of like, you know, Black Lives Matter, and, you know, like all these like chants that we would do, and seeing people on the other side, and seeing you yourself, like the people in solidarity and community and unity, and seeing the police and everyone else on the other side. It was like, there shouldn't be a division, but there is. But we have to be able to stand up for things as a community and as people, as humans. So yeah, that's my experience.
You want to weigh in?
Yeah, so I just have kind of two thoughts. Everyone said so many insightful things, but I want to just sort of highlight just the use of the words collective by, I think, both Elizabeth and Darian, because in my mind, I feel like this is a really powerful word that I feel like solidarity somehow kind of has a lot of historical baggage in my mind in terms of like how we think about solidarity, and that it does emerge in moments of crisis, as Alexius pointed out, whereas collectivity, and I think we can like really see this, like not just like, so why do we think we need solidarity? I mean, we can see what happens when we don't have collectivity right now, right? Like, because the public health crisis that we've been suffering into, you know, going into year 3 is a crisis of solidarity. It's a crisis of collectivity, because it's about individual rights, it's about individual protection. You're not protected, you know, this sort of ableist kind of understanding of the disease, and thinking like, oh, we're just all gonna get it, it'll be fine. And not thinking about the public health as a collective response, as a collective need for everybody along a spectrum of needs and a spectrum of privilege. So for me, like collectivity is like a way that I try to think about it that is not just about crisis, it's about how you operate every day, which hopefully prevents crisis, right? And we're always kind of responding after the fact because of the fact that we have like as a public, as a nation, you know, as a global community, we have a crisis of we don't see ourselves collectively. So I think that's just one thing that I think is is really like, for me, like I think about that a lot just in terms of that term. But I also want to just raise this phrase that I learned in this article called Toward Thick Solidarity by two activists, Roseanne Liu and Savannah Shang. And thick solidarity, as they describe it, and I'll read because I just pulled it up while we were talking. So this is from the article in Radical History Review, and they write, thick solidarity is based on a radical belief in the inherent value of each other's lives, despite never being able to fully understand or fully share in the experiences of those lives. Exploring the role that empathy plays in forming solidarities is an attempt to understand the personal and affective dimension to political commitments. And to me, this is really powerful because we're not, we're coming from our different experiences, lived experiences. We aren't, no one's ever gonna, if you haven't lived in my life as growing up as an under refugee, unless you're Vietnamese. I mean, I definitely relate. I'm sure Lee and I could definitely jam on some shared experiences, even across our generations. But, and other people can understand that as well. I mean, so there's a connection there, but then everything else is kind of based on empathy, right? It's based on a kind of understanding of how we can relate to each other as humans, and understanding that we're never going to understand it. We're not here to own other people's experiences in order to have that sense of solidarity or collectivity. So to me, the sort of radical idea of empathy and radical empathy is really about getting to that place where you don't necessarily need to share experiences. It's about under that collectivity at the root of our experiences.
What's the next one, Alexius? Is it in here?
Yeah. Oh no, yeah, I'm here. Just unmuted. And so I just wanted to say, as navigate to the next question, just hearing the different experiences when we talk about physical location, we talk about historical concepts of family, we talk about how we've seen solidarity pop up and represent in our communities, and the different paths in which we meet collectivity, where we met communal care, because it's not always at the same time along the same path. And speaking about these things, and we think about what it has looked like for you all in your time, and a lot of times we talked about the difference in spaces on a predominantly white institution. And so seeing as we're here at NC State and operating through that institution, several of you have either went to a predominantly white institution as shared, work at a predominantly white institution, or currently enrolled. What we expected and hope it to look like, what has it looked like on these campuses, and what ways do you feel like we as individuals can challenge or can support different spaces on predominantly white institutions that may not align with positive collectivity?
I will defer to the people who are going on those campuses, so pass it on, since I'm a community activist near a campus, but y'all can have that conversation. What do you think? Natalie?
Yes, I can vouch since I am a sophomore here at NC State. So not too much experience, especially with COVID, but still on campus. Well, I think going to NC State and it being a PWI, it's been really challenging, but it has helped me to grow individually as a person. I remember getting accepted into NC State, and again, I'm from a small town, and I was really excited to, get out of my small town and finally be able to, be in my own identity, be with other people that resonate with me in a way. And so I was really excited to come to Raleigh, and the city itself hopefully be more progressive in a way. And so once I got here to Raleigh in school, I was able to meet more Latinx students and just people of color in general. And that was the environment, that's the space that I wanted to be in. I didn't want to be with people that just look like me or just look like someone else. I wanted to be with people with different cultures, different ethnicities, different everything, because I feel like we're able to learn and grow with each other in that way. And we're able to educate ourselves in that way as well. And being here for about 2 years, I've definitely seen, especially being first generation, I think it adds a little bit more onto it, not only just being someone of color, but also being first generation is just like the struggles that you have to go through being first generation. And it's just like battling constantly between having that like imposter syndrome and just having to feel that you feel like you have to prove to someone, but you don't have to prove to anyone, because you belong here for, you're here for a reason, and you don't have to prove to anyone that you should belong there in a sense. And I feel like that's been my battle being here at a PWI, is that I feel everyone else has those opportunities and resources kind of, there for them. But I have to I'm first generation, so I don't have that. I have to be able to go out and reach for my opportunities, my resources, to be able to pave a pathway for incoming, Latinx students or people of color that are first generation, to guide them through that pathway and be a connection and a bridge for my community back home, and like my community that I'm building here in Raleigh and like at NC State, and hoping just to grow from there, and being able to be an access to other prospective students that are coming into these like big predominantly white institutions with the fear of that they're not enough, or that they need to prove to someone, or just someone that they belong here. But it's more of that battle. And being here also, it's like I have to battle with my cultural barrier in a sense. Being Latinx, it's very hard because you're used to I'm used to like my Latinx culture back home, and I think it's very different being here by myself. Yes, I still have my friends that I can resonate with and connect with and relate with, but I think it's very different growing up in a household with that culture, and then leaving and having a whole different like ball game of like how to live, how to heal, how to grow. And so I think that's just like my constant battle that I've been going through.
I really agree with a lot of what you had to say, especially considering there's already like a giant like little chest of problems that comes with like being a colored person, and then you're on a PWI, and also you're first generation, and you don't have like a role model to like ask, how do I become an adult, how do I go through college? And I think part of why I was like so flustered to answer this question is solidarity on our campus is so like subtle. It's almost like a whisper rather than a shout, because you have to like actively seek it out at times. While there's like the multicultural student center where you can visit and like become more involved, as well as like the African American Cultural Center, like you find these communities for yourself, and that's how you build solidarity. So like personally, like I came to seek my own community out. Like I kind of built my own community, finding like the group of friends that like I can relate to and trust. And like a lot of my peers, I see them go through that as well, where like they'll join like specific like race or like Asian cultural clubs on campus, as well as like sororities and fraternities, and find it that way. But like outside of like pushing yourself to be involved in those extracurriculars and those solidarity, like seeking organizations, like it's very hard to just see solidarity, especially like when we live in an age where performative activism is so like present and very pervasive. Especially like the community will like celebrate, oh, like this is a holiday, we'll do a big event, we'll raise some money, set it aside for that, and then that's about it. And then the rest of the year is like business as normal. Especially for myself, like I am an animal science major, and a lot of my peers in my classes are like largely white men that own land because they're in agriculture, and like they're interested in learning about farming and like veterinary medicine. It was so hard for me to go through and try to like go through my journey trying to become a veterinarian and find experiences, and also find someone who can relate to me and help guide me through that. And I honestly still struggle to find it, because I don't see other people like me in my field. I don't see other people who are going through the same struggles as I am. So in order to combat that, I have to like almost try to relate myself to other people, and like jumping through like hoops and bridges, trying to figure out like, okay, like here's how they did it. How can I apply that to myself how can I make my own path because someone else hasn't done it for me already.
Can I ask a real quick question? One thing that came up, I think, is when I think about schools, you have two historically Black colleges in Raleigh. You have St. Augustine and you have Shaw. But I also wonder, like, I hope I'm framing this right. When you're at school and then you graduate, who comes in behind you? Like, how far back can you dip into either junior high or high school? So before you even get to NC State or any of the schools that are in the state of North Carolina, how could you maybe break that cycle of just what you just shared? Like, why do we have to keep doing that over and over and over again? Are there any ideas, suggestions, or some kind of infrastructure? So whatever that quality of life might be, depending on who you are and where you've come from, first generation or not, it doesn't have to be replicated. And more importantly, do you leave and go, well, is that something you would recommend anyone else to go to the same school? It's more of a rhetorical question, but it gets into interesting thing about generationally, or just how you learn it before you get there and what you pass on or what you don't pass on. I'll just throw it out there for some response.
I'll just respond to that real quick from a faculty perspective. And this is just sort of endemic to the university as a conservative institution, right? And so one that resists change. And it is that there will be a program about it, but it will be underfunded, understaffed, and the need will be bigger than the reach a lot of times. So I'm a PAC Promise mentor. So for folks who are first gen students, right, then you have someone who's on campus who's available to ostensibly help with that, right? Help navigate those first few steps. And the turnover is high, and you don't necessarily get a chance to connect with someone in your intended major. And so it's a beautiful program, and I love being a part of it, and I've loved getting to know the students I've gotten to know. And then how many more folks though are that, and that forms, like PAC Promise forms a community, but there isn't always learning across or time to go back several generations, right? Sometimes high school students are brought in, but it's a small cohort in a specific space. So things are happening, but it's not considered a systemic good. And part of what it's enough to tick numbers and hit certain highlights on like your public things. And part of what I wanted to think about with the PWI, and I was really speaking, I'm so, Nettie and Lee, both of you, I'm so appreciative for your reflections as students, because there's so much just white supremacy masquerading as rigor at universities, right? There's so many ways in which the standards and the things that you have to learn are the same practices of refusing language, and they're genocidal practices, right? They're violent practices of requiring legibility in a white supremacist framework. And so so part of what solidarity looks like, just sort of depending on where you are, and I think faculty staff that are on this call, you all can speak to this as well, is about redefining what constitutes a university experience and what is happening here and what has value. And sometimes that means having to name, in order to be legible in these spaces that weren't built for you, you do need this skill set, but that's not the best way to communicate. Like, your home way of speaking actually does have more value, or does have more value to you, or as much value, or whatever. And how do we move the space towards those being alongside each other and mutually beneficial and reciprocal, instead of, once you get here, here's the program and you assimilate to it. And then also we'll have these culture days, and sometimes, you'll get a holiday and that's it.
I think, Elizabeth, that really brings us into our next segment in question. Is like, we've acknowledged the different spaces and how we exist and operate, but like, what recommendations do you all have for forming solidarity and communal care in places where distrust and performity does exist?
Who wants that one, y'all?
Wait, can we type that question in the chat?
Yes, I will drop it for you in one moment.
And while you're doing that, I guess I'm just curious too, because I'm really interested, intrigued about those of us who are like the proximity to the campus, because oftentimes you have like a relationship, and when you drop it in, I think one of the best example is when we were trying to get schools to divest of South Africa. You know, when you think about the city of Durham, when they passed, the city and county of Durham said we will no longer do any contracts with anyone that has holdings in South Africa, but we went to Duke University, and they were the ones who had to have a meeting, and they had a special session, and lo and behold, they voted to divest. So you just wonder, like, what school, what institution, but the community, activists, parents, friends, whatever that might be, and how that collectively within a community and a town and a city can have huge impact in terms of what that looks like going forward. But that would just be one example I'm thinking of. And the other one real quick is also going to be the Mount Olive pickle boycott. When you had, when you think about the farm laborers out there in Eastern North Carolina, horrible working conditions, horrible living conditions. And it wasn't until you had the Catholic Church and some school folk and some organizations that got involved. But it's one thing if Mandy Carter doesn't buy Mount Olive pickles at the food line, but when you have an institution like North Carolina State University saying we're not going to buy that product, that's a game changer. You know, so you think about who's part of that conversation, and I think that's just a wonderful model. Talk about solidarity and unity. That's just a great example of how that can make a difference in a proactive way. So as a grassroots organizer, I think we did pretty good on that one, but I'll stop now and have someone else pick up the question and respond.
A response to the question, okay, yeah. What do they, being the panelists, so what do we have? Performing solidarity and communal, what recommendations do we have performing solidarity and communal care in places where there exists distrust and performativity? So the first recommendation is pointing at it and defining it. And it's like, yo, that thing that they just said they were doing, that's not exactly what it seems. So get into the root of the problems and get into the, like, really defining, first of all, what performativity is, or what performative allyship is, or putting putting the definitions in plain sight and saying this is wrong, even though it looks right. So that's the first recommendation, and that's something where it's like you can't fix a problem if you don't acknowledge that it is a problem. And to points made earlier about going to college, just saying that going to college in the US, that has classes, racial, let's start there, class and racial implications that we all get from TV and movies. So when we call it out, make it plain and say, yo, this is a problem. However, a lot of people don't perceive it as a problem, but here's why it is a problem. And here's who it affects. Here's who it, not just who it negatively impacts, but also who it continues to benefit. So this one thing that I've been learning in sociology classes is the idea of like unmarked categories and unmarked social categories. So being, you have a social system and you talk about there's people who are being oppressed by it, marginalized by it. Some people are just negatively impacted. But if you're only focusing on people who are damaged by the social system in place without shining the light on, hold up, no, but wait a minute. Why are y'all complicit in all of this? Or why is it that they're benefiting from all of this, like this status quo? So another recommendation is actually not just focusing on who is negatively impacted, but also focusing on, well, not focusing, but like highlighting and understanding why another group is benefiting from the status quo. So you can apply this to any social identity background. And that's the thing. When we have these solidarity conversations, it's not just like, for example, with racism, it's not just a Black versus white people issue, the way you constantly see it in TV and movies. It's way bigger than just a two-race party, to even get political with it. But those two main recommendations with defining the problem, even though it doesn't seem like a problem, is a really big step that even I've been learning from stuff. So like, second semester, my first.
Darren, we keep losing you. We lost you for connection. I don't know if you can hear us or hear me. We'll navigate to the next person and circle back around once your connection reconnects. And so I know Leli was about to jump into the space, so please feel free to take it away.
I think North Carolina State University is such a good example for where like they really need to start forming solidarity and building trust back in their students, especially during the previous few semesters, like especially like with the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement. Like there's so many times where North Carolina State University just chose to do the wrong thing. And I think starting to like rebuild that trust and like starting to show like that they actually care, they can start by listening and like practicing what they say. So I think they released like 2 letters, like one just from the university, one from the chancellor during Black Lives Matter, saying like, we're with you, here's some resources, go to our student health center if you need help. And that's about it. And they blatantly ignored an open letter from their 100th student government student body president, Melanie Flowers, who is a Black woman who wrote a letter in conjunction with like a Black-led student group asking for demands for like better resources for Black students and minority students, making sure that like their voices are being heard, holding conversations like this, honestly, regularly on a basis with administrators, with faculty, then can actually incite change. And one thing that wasn't in the letter that the student group also asked of the university was removing Chadwick Jason Seagraves, who was a faculty member at the university, who was a known white supremacist and a member of the Proud Boys. And I think all that came out of it was like an investigation, and then they said they couldn't find any association with that. Instead, what they did was, oh, we're changing the name of Daniels Hall, which was named after an editor of an anti-Black newsletter in Wilmington, North Carolina, when they were trying to join Wilmington, the university over there, with like a Black school. And that's all they did. That is all they did, like since March of 2020, in order to improve lives of Black students here on campus. And honestly, it comes down to like who is now responsible for making sure that change happens? Is it on the students, faculty, and administrators to put pressure on people who can create change? Or does it need to be something that comes from like the top down? They have to be willing to learn, be willing to unlearn everything that they've learned, like be openly anti-racist and make these changes and talk to other people in order to make these changes happen. And it's just something that it's a really difficult conversation, but that's what we're here for.
Yes, difficult conversations, but that's what we're here for. And I feel like a lot of times we talk about having conversations, calling each other in. We have to speak about sitting and being willing to sit in that discomfort, right? Because we all come from a place of learning and understanding and having to relearn. And so I appreciate you definitely for bringing that to the forefront and just having conversations about having to rebuild trust. and connection when we talk about spaces where performity and a lack of communal care exist. And that's having these uncomfortable conversations, but also very transformative and representative conversations. And so I just want to say thank you for sharing that piece in space. And we want to navigate and honing that in and talking about addressing where typically in media and projecting it is when we sit in different communities and different ethnic and racial backgrounds and have different agendas, how does solidarity look like from a global perspective, an extra-racial perspective? Because we're sitting here on the screen from different backgrounds, different generations, and how do we show up for each other and each other's agendas and really support beyond our own communities. And so I'm gonna drop in the chat the shorter version already pre-typed, but just wanted to now bring into this FATMA conversation is, okay, now that we're addressing the large or white supremacy as far as like the concept and the systems that we work in, how do we show up for each other that don't exist in the same community, that don't have the same faith base, that don't speak same languages, that don't have the same class expectations? How do we show up for each other?
Oh, I'd like to just maybe start the ball rolling a little bit. And you know, I have to say this COVID thing is now going into third year, and I know a lot of our community, we've lost several people, and I'm not trying to be like too sad, but I'm just sitting here thinking about what does this look like going forward. But what I've been intrigued by, when I mentioned that earlier about why it mattered that you had people involved in the lives and the quality of life of people who are doing the farm organizing, you know, who's picking the crops or chickens or whatever it might be. But I was sitting here thinking in a very practical way. And also look at language justice now. You know, when we do these now, I was realizing, Alexius, that you know how you do the chat, you have the chat box, but you can put that in Spanish, you can do ASL. This has probably done a lot more interesting, innovative ways of if and when we get past all of this, what will we hang on to in terms of communicating and carrying on. What I've really been trying to stuck by is that if I had to think for a minute, what would be the one or two, three things, no matter where I lived, what language I spoke, no matter where I came from, what would be the 2 or 3 things that I think would put us in the same space of wanting to have some way to communicate and collaborate? And I like that. So here are the things that I thought of, and then I'm sure people can add to the mix. Clean air, clean water. No one should be hungry. No one should be homeless. Everyone should have access to an education. Everyone should have access to health. You know, and if you just made this little laundry list, and then if you realize once you put that out there, then all of a sudden it's like, well, that's not what divides us. That's what actually puts us together. And I'll give a perfect example. I am now on Medicare. That's all I can afford now. I go to the Lincoln Community Health Clinic here in Durham. That clinic used to be segregated. Only Black folk go there now. But now, because there's an intentionality of people speaking Latinx, and however you have to do a way to let people know your illness or your health issues, that's been a game changer. And so when like for instance, if someone comes in, like I'm 73 now, and I don't know how to speak a lot of Spanish. I flunked it when I was in high school, thinking, did it matter? Yeah, it really does now. It does. But I was thinking about the Latinx community or the other communities here in Durham, North Carolina would be a perfect example. How could I communicate that to someone? And sometimes it's not about the words you use, but it's about the cultural stuff that you might share. So they're called patient advocates. You know, I'm just trying to just sort of brainstorm a little bit. But how creative can we be? Because it matters if you have an issue around health and you can't breathe or clean air, or what you're living in a place that has, like, you know, no way to have any kind of heat or coolness, you know, given where we are in the South. So I was just trying to think if we had to collectively say, here are 5 things in my relation to what I do every day in my day-to-day life, what would be the commonality of what that could be? And that's what I love. That's the excitement factor of what that could be. And I'll add this one other mix. As part of the baby boomers now, like we're all over 70 and 60s, but it's those 18 to 40-year-olds. I want to know how we're going to be having each other's companies and each other's ways of being involved in a way that collectively makes it a collective we going forward. So that's the part I love. And I don't know, I'm eager to find that out, and I'm excited to be a part of the conversation as we move on. But that would just be one example of, like, you know, clean air, clean water, you know, that little list. But I'll stop there. But that would be my 2 cents worth to put into the conversation.
My Wi-Fi was like, shut up. So I'm back. But, and this actually is going to connect full circle with what I was already talking about earlier. So one thing, and this is just to answer this really good question, how do we break silos in our identity groups to build solidarity? So back to my story from before, learning more about gender, and with me being in an unmarked category who benefits from patriarchy, like when I understood what it meant for there to be gender inequality and inequality across sexual orientation, across like gender and sex. So when I learned about that in my women's studies course, my first year of college, I was like, oh my gosh, wait a minute. First of all, I've been living as an unmarked category my whole life. I had no idea, because I benefited from the system in some form or fashion. Not so much that, you know, I got the resources and I was like, haha, I'm going to hoard everything. But it was more of, I didn't have to deal with certain issues that someone who doesn't identify as a man, who doesn't present masculine, just has to deal with. So when it comes to women, trans women, when it comes to gay men, like cisgender heterosexuality, I benefit from the systems that are in that. So with me now understanding that within my silo, and that can be a silo of people who are also cis, also who may not understand things from sociological, psychological, all that fancy words. Like when it comes to just being a decent human being and understanding that just because somebody doesn't look like you or act like you from a racial standpoint or gender standpoint, sexual orientation standpoint, doesn't mean you should treat them poorly. / understanding the roots of that behavior and calling it out. Like I would have these types of conversations with my parents and uncles and aunts, and just talking about whenever they make a comment about something on TV where it's like X, Y, and Z is happening on the screen, I just be like, crap, that is sexist. You just said, but I won't call it out with like the specific term, but I'll talk about what just happened from a practical standpoint and just speaking up and saying, bro, it's not okay. Now, sometimes it doesn't always happen in the moment. However, addressing it at all is a key point in understanding the influence you have within your social silo and how that contributes to solidarity across whatever identity background. So that was what I was trying to say. My Wi-Fi was like useless, but yeah, that's what it is. You'd be surprised at how much power your voice has, even with the people that you're most familiar with and you're least comfortable talking about certain topics. But the more you talk about those topics and the more you bring stuff up, the more you say, that's not okay, or it made me uncomfortable, here's why. And not so much to like demonize or vilify the other person, but just to be like, yo, I learned this thing. How do you feel about what I just learned? And then it's a learning experience for everybody involved. So that's what that looks like in one capacity.
Yes, I would like to go next, if that's okay. I'm going to bring up the question about solidarity in a global perspective. I think within itself, perspective is the key word. Perspective is everything. I think if we're able to open our minds and listen to someone else's perspective and respect someone else's perspective, we're able to grow just within that simple conversation that we have with another person. But I think as like generations, as we continue to grow as humans and with technology and everything, I think a way that solidarity will show up within our lives and that it's starting to show up within our lives, I think a big platform is social media. And I really think that through like podcasts, through TV shows, through movies, through books within themselves, through just everyone's like perspective that they pitch in, we're able to educate ourselves about different situations of different things that we're kind of grown up, socialized or conditioned to know or to believe or to function in a way, if that makes sense. But I feel like that's a big game changer, is by educating ourselves and by starting to listen to those podcasts or reading and stuff, because we're able to open our minds to new perspectives and able to be more aware of what we say and what we do in a sense. Because I don't know, but I feel like as humans, we don't really know and comprehend how important our words are and how our actions like affect people. And I feel like as we grow up and as we, get older, we don't realize that until we are older, and everything. So it's going to be really hard to be able to stand in solidarity if we don't educate ourselves, because before we can stand for something, we have to be able to know why we're standing for that thing.
Thank you so much for sharing those pieces. And so from like hearing about, okay, what are some next steps, what are things we can do, is one, primarily sitting in education, whether it is in forms of conversations, in form of education and literature from different places across the board. And that could be sitting in a language place, that could be sitting in a racial, cultural specifics area. I'm really coming from a historical concept. And I think that this place is a wonderful place to kind of make a space for everyone to share out. In the chat, everyone that's in this space right now, is share ways in which you challenge yourself outside of your main identities to learn and to educate about other communities and folks in order to further understanding and solidarity. And you can unmute or drop in the chat, but I'll start it off in being transparent and sharing. Coming up through life, I was predominantly raised as a Christian. And so a lot of different things in that community came with a lot of, to me, as I grew older and looked and questioned and learned, came with a lot of trauma compared to historical content and the ways Christianity has been used to assimilate, control, and harm different communities throughout history. And so I had to recognize and have conversations about how different faiths and pieces are looked at as views and connected, but also recognizing that that's all that I knew. And I need to challenge myself to learn in other spaces so that way I could be able to assist in other communities and other work, especially from a faith-based place. So I previously have been a legal advocate and interpersonal violence response advocate. And so a lot of the work we connected with sometimes was having conversations about how religion impacted how folks navigated some abusive conversations, or how family dynamics were different, expectations and relationships were different. And so what I did for myself was to not go based off assumptions and based off opinions that life had taught me about other religions and spaces, and choose to learn, whether it was attending different spaces. For example, in Raleigh, Durham, like we have a segment that I'm so thankful to be able to attend where it's like Ask Islam, and we're able to come and have different questions and conversations and learn, or be in this space where I'm able to meet different folks of other religious beliefs and have open conversations about how it impacts them, where I first grew up that this is the only religion that you can know or connect with, and I had to challenge that thought and mindset about my belief system and be willing to learn other belief systems. And so for me, that's one thing that's helped have grown me in my existence. is to learn the different historical concepts and the different history of multiple religions and faiths. And then it's like also be able to connect and understand that we can have different beliefs, but the core of caring for each other, the core of communal advancement, the core of celebrating and honoring our history and our elders was always a place of connectivity. So please, y'all, drop in the chat ways that you challenge yourself, challenge biases, challenge understandings, just so that we can kind of connect in learning, which is a powerful tool and a powerful thing. And I know Mandy has been dropping some places that we can all connect to and learn in the chat. So please don't be shy.
I have a question for everyone, just to follow what you just shared. I just wonder how many, I'll put it this way. I know that had it not been for my high school social studies teacher when I was in junior in high school, up in Mount Pleasant High School in Schenectady, they brought someone in from the American Friends Service Committee. I had never heard of this organization prior to this gentleman coming in. That was like what, in my junior year. And he said 3 things that day. And if we went around and asked people like, who inspired you, who, what, where, when, but he said 3 things that day, is why I'm here on this conversation all these years later. This is like 1963, 64, 65. This is the height of the civil rights organizing happening down south. But as a predominantly white peace organization, their concept is full equality and justice for all. That was the first thing he shared. The second thing he said was really mind-boggling a little bit. He talked about the power of one, that each and one of us has the potential to impact change if we chose to, work on it. But it didn't make any sense. But it was the third thing he said. We have a high school work camp in the Pocono Mountains of Pennsylvania who would like to go. I went there as a junior in high school. And when I went there, I was so astounded by, that's the first time I heard Bayard Rustin, that black gay guy who helped organize the 1963 March on Washington. The first time I heard the name Audre Lorde. But the first time I heard that there was a concept that you could, as one person believing in what you believed in, and you have principles and values, if you organize that. And at the time, I was a little too young for the civil rights movement, but that was the Vietnam War happening at that time. But the Quakers, they're now like in 110 years, whatever that was. But I wonder how many times that we have been either invited to or accidentally bumped into, Alexia, I'm thinking of you, when that has just touched your life in such a way. And one of the couples, and I'll end with this, there was this folk singing couple, they called themselves culture workers from the Highlander Center. The Highlander Center was intentionally started in 1932 with Black and white folk out here in, rural Tennessee to figure out how they were going to organize to make social justice happen in the South. It is still there to this day. Candy Carowin, who I met at the age of 17, and her partner, Guy, were now both in the Council of Elders. All these years later, I'm just getting tears around how many times you bunch into people, or you bump into someone, or you have no idea like what that could mean to you. It's like, I get excited about that, but that's amazing to me. And so generationally, as part of the baby boomers, it's those 18 to 40-year-olds, I'm looking at who's on this screen, but if we get that all pulled together, oh my. And I'm going to say this right up front, that vote, that what has happened yesterday, we're trying to figure out how they're going to suppress that vote. Don't do it. And if you have to find some kind of reason and principle about whatever your issue might be, understanding that's a fundamental principle. But I just shared that. That's my little story about why I'm here 55 years later, deciding to sit against the war in Vietnam. And thank you, Guy and Candy Carowin, for what you did as well. But I'll pass it on to the next person. Hong, let's pass it on to you. You're here in Durham. I'll pass it on to you.
Thanks. I have so many thoughts because I know there's a lot of questions been thrown out. So I've been trying to figure out like what to say and how to summarize what I've been thinking about. But just going also back to sort of what you were, your earlier story or your earlier question, Mandy, too, of, how we can collectivize, and just thinking about, this way of coming together over what you're describing as kind of like what I've read as being like points of unity, right? Where are the points of unity that we can get down with, that transcend our silos of identity, right? Which, you know, as you mentioned in your example, the you know, clean air and clean water, how can we not get down with that, right? So thinking about like how in our own communities, you know, I think about it also, I kind of break it down just sort of in terms of how I learned organizing, also through kind of an anarchist framework, and thinking about just like, is it territorial? Is it education? Is it labor, right? So around these moments where you can sort of find these points of unity that can bring together lots of different people in order to really rally around a cause, or fighting for justice, or for rights. So I think that that's like a really, you know, powerful and simple tool, right? Is sort of articulating these points of unity. And just thinking about just like an example that, you know, kind of the first that I ever experienced as being someone who's been teaching at UNC for a while is around Silent Sam, and the amazing cross-racial, cross-generational, cross-community work that we all did to get Silent Sam down, and the continued fight that was, you know, kind of up and down across, again, students, community activists, people from around the triangle, faculty, not as much faculty, sadly, mostly student driven, which was amazing. Student driven, a lot of, you know, the force was really coming from the students and on the ground, and faculty like myself were really learning and taking the lead from students. But that really was a beautiful cross-racial, you know, generational and cross kind of, hierarchical boundaries of the university to really pull together around that. That also pulled in kind of anti-police brutality and anti-policing on campus. It brought together, you know, it also brought up labor issues. So it really was able to pull together all of these ways that students and faculty and community members could understand, you know, around this sort of symbol that kind of encapsulated all these issues and injustices that everyone could rally around. So I think about that just as like an example, powerful example of pulling people together on campus, and where are those sort of flashpoints that people can rally around. And then the last thing I'll say is just like thinking about just, I mean, I'm someone who makes things, I'm an artist, I work in photography and video, and I just think, you know, the way that I also came about in terms of, I feel like my own connection or my own kind of openness to people and to justice is also about storytelling. So I think that a lot of times, you know, Darian, you're talking about just sort of speaking within our communities and these sort of basic everyday ways that can happen, but I would love to see more intentional spaces where people are learning how to share their stories, learning how to you know, make these stories through visual or written form that then become a more like, you know, significant way that you're sort of building these connections across communities and across racial or ethnic boundaries. Because I think that, you know, I mean, I think also, not to mention just sort of generally like TV and books and movie, yeah, culture and storytelling is powerful, but, you know, we don't even have to turn to sort of mainstream to do that. I think that I would love to see more programming that does have this kind of intentionality around the storytelling within our spaces themselves or across spaces that could be really meaningful, because the tools of storytelling, I think, beyond these sort of platforms that oftentimes have a tendency to be more performative or perhaps more tokenized, that there's more meaning that can be made even within just like storytelling in a more intentional way amongst ourselves. Obviously, we're storytelling here, but just think about storytelling as a form, you know what I mean? And yeah, and I just appreciate, Mandy, all your historical contextualization of your own work and the work that we are in sort of in kind of in relationship with, in community with, right? That you know, all of the things that you've learned feel like I passed you. You probably don't remember all the, I've learned a lot from you, Mandy. I've learned a lot from Southerners on New Ground. I've learned a lot from, my own work, being on the ground in the community in Durham. So I think that it's, just want to say thanks to you too.
And thanks back to you too, by the way. Be glad when we back and be in the same space with each other.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Chong. And that was a wonderful way to kind of wrap up and summarize the spaces and pieces that we navigate about how to show up in space, a recommendation to how to keep the movements going, having conversations, but more and making it more into a storytelling framework. And I think that's very powerful in itself, which I will drop some links in the chat that we've been working on with the MLK exhibit and Wolf Tales on campus for this week that does center in pieces on sharing history and sharing stories. And tomorrow we are having a workshop with Nikki Franco at 11 o'clock about how we actually want to imagine ourselves and imagine doing the work and having more of a hands-in journaling and dreaming and fortuity piece as we think about MLK and the commemoration of his work and centering and honoring these pieces this week. And so I think that's the perfect space to we want to navigate and to open the floor for any questions that you all may have for the panelists, or any thoughts that you may want to share out after being in such an impactful space of hearing and learning from you all's experience and vast knowledge. So now I'll open the floor to everyone that is in the space. Please feel free to unmute or drop in the chat.
I have a question I'd love to just put out to everyone, and I'm so grateful to all of you for sharing your stories today. And some of you have touched on some of this in what you've shared already, but I'm curious if there is a specific person or a story who really impacted you and your understanding of solidarity, and kind of expanding your vision of how we can find solidarity.
I'll start real quick and then pass it on. I just shared to you, maybe that's a good question, Virginia, because in one way, sometimes I hear I can't be a Dr. Martin Luther King. I can't be a, Rosa Parks, but it's our daily lives that we get up every day and go about our business. And one thing I was really struck by is that you never know, like you and anyone else being around, if the fact that you have an African-American cultural center, a women's center, gender studies center, they may never step into that office, but they know it's there. And now that you have this amazing social network, you have people who are like struggling. They have no support, no one to be around them, but there's a place they can feel they can touch and have a place called home. But also just then really figuring out, like, what's the thing we can do every single day we get up and go about our business? Do we smile? Do we, out there about being out and around? I think that has just been really so powerful to me. And that gets to the power of one, like ONE, little one, like each one of us. And the other thing I'll add real quick, I would just be curious, like you asked the question for you, if you just wanted to share for right now, who or what touched your life in a way that you're even being on this call? And I'll pass it back to you, and then we'll pass it on to someone else. Like for you, someone or something that touched your life, Virginia.
There's a lot of people that I could think of. There is a person who I knew growing up. I grew up in a college town in Mississippi, and a woman who ran a restaurant, Miss Isaiah's Busy Bee Cafe. She was a community leader. She was an activist. She connected with every person who came through her door of her business in such a personal way that really created one of the more safe spaces, I'd say, in a small town in Mississippi in the 90s. That's when I was growing up there. And just the way that she cared for everyone. It really was the first example I think I've seen of community care and how love and empathy is the foundation for solidarity, that it is a really personal, person to person, from the community ground up kind of relationship that can create change. So yeah, that's the first person that comes to mind for me.
Thank you. Pass it on. Don't be shy now. Darian?
Yeah, I was actually thinking about my mother. She has such a caring and giving spirit, and she taught that. But my mom and my dad both taught us, my sister and I, what it means to actually give and be of service to people. And the one thing that she always, specifically my mother, she was like, it's not really about helping people for the sake of, getting accolades or helping someone who can help you back, but it was more about how much are you helping people that can't help you back? How much are you helping people that legit have nothing to do with you, zero connection to you in any way, shape, or form? And how are you helping people without them even knowing that you helped them? And understanding that element of service and understanding that it also doesn't take a lot to do. Like imagine you going to a fast food drive-through, right? And pay for your food, but then you ask the cashier, "Yo, can I pay for the person behind me?" Like that type of stuff. Like she's modeled that, and my father, he's modeled that in elements of service and just like those simple ways of just stepping outside yourself, decentralizing yourself from whatever you're doing in your daily life. And it doesn't always come in the form of money or like physical, tangible things, but it comes in emotional support. It comes in just spending time in a specific place or with a specific person, a group of people. So yeah, I would say that like my parents are the ones who are they showed me how to serve. They showed me how to do for others, even when they can't do the same for me. And they also showed me the importance of just being a vessel. So when someone does something for me, keep that same thing going to the next person. So yeah, that's what has been resonating with me after you asked that question.
Elizabeth?
There are so many people that come to mind, like a lot of folks have said. I just want to bring into the space both of my grandmothers who lived to be quite old. One of my grandmothers was born and died in the same room 96 years apart, which is pretty incredible. And they live very low to the ground in a lot of ways, but the thing that calls to me to mention specifically, and I wish I could name these folks, is all the librarians that I've interacted with in my life. So for anyone whose access to books was libraries, and I was really lucky to grow up in a time where there were libraries that you could walk to still, and more of them around. And I just think I had interests in things. Like I really wanted to understand lots of historical things, and I wanted things in and out of what my reading level, whatever that was. And I am so grateful for those folks who pointed me towards books, and school librarians too. And I just, for me, so many things have come out of books that have been resonant. And I've also been incredibly gifted to interact with many, many people who said many things. So I want to call in librarians and be appreciative of them. And I'll stop there.
Lee?
I wouldn't say that I've been especially like influenced by one specific person, but just a lot of good people throughout my life who kind of showed me what it is to be a good person. Well, while I love my grandma and mom to death, they're definitely like from an older generation, and that's not to make like excuses for them. And I see myself having to go through a lot of unlearning with them and kind of guiding them through that, guiding like some of their older beliefs and stuff. And it kind of shows me like I don't ever want to be filled with that much hate. That seems like a lot of energy for me, but it kind of like also showed me like what the kind of person I want to be, like the good people I see in my everyday life. I want to be more like that. I'll pass it off.
Huh?
I think that was, were you calling me Mandy? Okay. Gosh, there's so many people. I mean, I think like, I'll just, you know, just sort of because I'm in Durham and just thinking about, you know, I really came into, you know, my work, you know, as an activist in Durham, and there's so many people that I learned from in my early 20s, but I will say, just thinking about solidarity and thinking about like, again, coming into my own consciousness as a, you know, as a community member, I remember just meeting Ray Urquhart, brother Ray, for the first time in Durham, and he sadly passed on to ancestors. Has it been 2 years now? Maybe 2 years. But he was an elder and, you know, an amazing longtime activist, labor organizer. And, you know, the first time that I felt I was so, it was so disarming because I was so welcomed by him when I first met him. And I was this young person with no experience, entering this community, trying to learn my way. And he just made me feel so welcome. And it made me just immediately feel like, oh, like, I mean, it was solidarity without even having to be solidarity. It was just like, yeah, you're one of us. Come, let's go, you know? I'm just like getting teary. I think about it. So I think of Ray, I'm sorry. He was really meaningful to a lot of people. Yeah, so I think of Ray and I think of just a lot of people in that time period. This was like the early 2000s that I really came up in Durham, and, you know, even my good friend and comrade now, Manju Rahendran, who was also just a young whippersnapper. She was younger than me at the time, but an amazing leader. She'd like wise beyond her years. So I'm really grateful to have met her at the time. So there's so many people in Durham that I met at the time, again, when I was around 21, 22, that really made an amazing, huge impact on me. And Mandy, you're in there too, because it was like several years where it was just a blitz of just meeting amazing, incredible people across communities that were doing incredible work around labor and anti-war. At the time, a lot of anti-Iraq war actions. So I feel like I just learned a lot from that. And then I'll just speak into the space another person who was a huge mentor to me, who was an academic mentor, but Deborah Willis, who is a photographer and historian. And she was my first real mentor that really showed me that like my stories were important and needed to be shared, and was really also the reason why like she kind of pulled everything together for me in terms of just sort of speaking from where I was, and then kind of all of the learning that I was doing on the ground in the community. So Deborah Willis, amazing.
Manny?
Yeah, just real quickly, I would like to say my parents, they are such a big factor of why I do a lot of my things, and my aspirations, and especially, you know, again, being first generation Latinx. I know I keep repeating it, but it's also like very important to know because like that's who I am. And I will never forget that because of every struggle that I've overcome, every struggle that I'm going to overcome. And yeah, I think just being here at NC State, being able to go to college within itself, I am able to live this dream that my parents have forever lived to dream back in Mexico. And they didn't know, you know, that their daughter was going to go to NC State, but I am here now. And yeah.
Thank you all for sharing and bringing forth ancestors and folks that are here with us in love and in joy into this space, and being able to see the appreciation reign through and the impact reign through is just amazing. And so